On the 24th of November 1326, the marketplace in Hereford, England, is packed with people, nobles, clergy, merchants, peasants, all crowded together to witness a spectacle of brutal justice. At the center, elevated above the throng, a wooden platform has been constructed. On it, guards bring a man of about 40 years. His face is pale and gaunt after days of self-imposed starvation. His clothes, once sumptuous, are now torn and filthy. This man, who was once the most powerful in the kingdom after the king himself, will be executed today in a manner so horrific that it will echo through the centuries. His name is Hugh Despenser, the younger, favorite, and possible lover of King Edward II of England. Within hours, his mutilated body will serve as a bloody example of what happens when someone accumulates too much power and makes even more powerful enemies. To understand how Hugh Despenser came to this terrible end, we must go back in time and explore the complex web of power, ambition, sexuality, and betrayal that defined England in the early 14th century. Hugh Despenser was born around 1286, son of Hugh Despenser the Elder and Isabel Beauchamp, daughter of the Earl of Warwick. Born into a noble family with important connections, young Hugh had a privileged start in life. His father was a loyal servant to King Edward I, the father of Edward II, and the Despenser family already enjoyed considerable wealth and influence. From an early age, Hugh was raised to follow in his father's footsteps, serving the crown and expanding family power. The opportunity for advancement came when Edward I ascended to the throne in 1307. The new king was already known for his preference for male favorites. His first intimate friend, Piers Gaveston, had caused enormous scandal at court, not only by monopolizing the king's affection but also through his arrogance and disrespect toward the traditional nobility. When Gaveston was brutally murdered by rebellious barons in 1312, a vacuum opened in the monarch's inner circle. Hugh Despenser knew how to take advantage of the situation. By 1316, he had already cultivated a close friendship with the king, becoming his chamberlain, a position of extreme intimacy that allowed constant access to the royal person. Simultaneously, Hugh strengthened his position through a strategic marriage to Eleanor de Clare, the king's own niece, who brought him the rich lordship of Glamorgan in Wales. As the relationship between Hugh and Edward I deepened, the favorite's power grew exponentially. Despenser developed an insatiable appetite for lands and wealth. Using his influence over the king, he manipulated the legal system to expropriate lands from other nobles and even from vulnerable widows. One of his victims was his own sister-in-law, whom he forced to surrender valuable properties. When temporarily exiled from England during a baronial rebellion in 1321, he even became a pirate, attacking English merchant ships in a shocking demonstration of disregard for the law. When Edward I managed to regain control over the rebellious nobility, Hugh returned from exile more powerful than ever. Between 1322 and 1326, the Despensers, father and son, did not merely participate in government. They were the government. Hugh the Younger controlled access to the king, manipulated royal finances, and exercised control over vast territories. The medieval historian Jean Froissart wrote that he was King of England in everything but title. However, what made the situation even more explosive were rumors about the nature of the relationship between Hugh and the king. Although married and the father of several children, suspicions that Hugh maintained an intimate relationship with Edward circulated at court. Chroniclers of the time suggested he was a sodomite, a term used in the medieval period for homosexual relations, considered not only sinful by the Church, but also an offense against social and divine order. Queen Isabella, Edward I's wife and daughter of the King of France, was particularly hostile to Hugh Despenser. Humiliated by the evident preference her husband showed for his favorite, Isabella saw her position, her resources, and even access to her own children progressively limited by Hugh's interference. In 1324, Despenser went to the extreme of confiscating the queen's lands and imprisoning members of her royal household. Even the children of the royal couple were removed from Isabella's custody and given to Hugh's wife. The queen's hatred found an outlet when, in 1325, she was sent to France to negotiate a peace treaty. There Isabella met Roger Mortimer, a powerful baron who had escaped from the Tower of London, where he had been sent for opposing the Despensers, and fled to the continent. Mortimer became her lover and ally in the conspiracy that planned to overthrow Edward II and his favorite. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a small army of mercenaries. What surprised Edward and the Despensers was the speed with which the English nobility joined the invaders. Years of abuse, extortion, and humiliation had created widespread hatred against the king's favorites. With the collapse of support, Edward Hugh and the Despensers fled to western England, taking with them a considerable portion of the royal treasury. The escape, however, was doomed to failure. Father and son Despenser were separated. Hugh the elder was captured in Bristol and subjected to an immediate and brutal execution. On the 27th of October 1326, he was hanged, still wearing his armor. Afterward, he was beheaded and his body quartered and thrown to the dogs, a terrible end for a man who had served the English crown for decades. Meanwhile, Edward Hugh and Hugh the Younger continued their desperate flight through Wales. Abandoned by almost all their followers, they were finally captured near Neath in mid-November. Edward was taken into captivity, where he would be forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, the future Edward II. As for Hugh Despenser, an even more terrible fate awaited him. Knowing he would have no chance of mercy, Hugh attempted suicide through starvation. His plan failed. On the 24th of November, he was brought to trial before a tribunal presided over by his mortal enemies, Roger Mortimer, Queen Isabella, and the Lancastrian barons who had suffered so much from his extortions. The trial was a brutal formality. Hugh was accused of an extensive list of crimes, treason, theft, corruption, and manipulation of the king. To avoid the appearance of pure personal vengeance, the tribunal took care to legalize the process. However, the outcome was inevitable from the beginning. Hugh was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to one of the most horrific executions ever recorded in English history. On the morning of the 24th of November, Hugh Despenser was taken to the marketplace in Hereford. An immense crowd had gathered, including Mortimer, Isabella, and the victorious barons. What followed was a carefully orchestrated spectacle of public vengeance and humiliation. First, Hugh was tied to a tall ladder so that everyone could see his torment. A crown of nettles was placed on his head, a brutal parody of the royal crown that he had, in practice, shared with Edward. Biblical verses denouncing arrogance and evil were written on his skin. Then the real torture began. According to the chronicler Jean Froissart, the executioners cut off Hugh's genitals and burned them in a fire before his eyes, a punishment specifically chosen to punish his supposed sodomitic practices. While he was still conscious, his abdomen was opened and his entrails were slowly removed and also burned. Witnesses reported that Hugh emitted a dreadful and inhuman howl that echoed through the square, to the delight and joy of the spectators. Only after this prolonged torture was Hugh finally hanged. But even in death, his humiliation continued. His body was beheaded and quartered into 4 parts, which were sent for display in different cities of the kingdom. His head was placed on a stake at the London Gate, a grim reminder of the fate of those who abused royal power. The specific brutality of Hugh Despenser's execution had multiple purposes. On one hand, it served as revenge for the cruelty and greed he had demonstrated during his dominance. On the other, it was a way to symbolically expiate the pollution that many believed he had brought to the kingdom through his influence over Edward Hugh and his alleged sexual relationship with the monarch. The public castration, in particular, was designed to highlight and punish this sexual transgression. Just 4 years later, in December 1330, Hugh's widow, Eleanor de Clare, received permission to collect and bury his remains on the family property in Gloucestershire. However, of him, only the head, a femur bone, and a few fragments were recovered, an undignified end for someone who had once been the second most powerful man in England. Edward Hugh's fate was no less grim. Initially kept prisoner, he was murdered in September 1327 at Berkeley Castle. The most enduring legend about his death, though contested by some modern historians, is that he was killed by a red-hot poker inserted into his rectum, a method that would leave no visible marks but would cruelly allude to his supposed sexual practices. The macabre symbolism of this death reflects the same kind of perversely poetic justice applied to Hugh Despenser. The reign of Edward Hugh and the rise and fall of Hugh Despenser remain one of the most turbulent periods in medieval English history. For centuries, the narratives about these men were shaped by homophobia and moral condemnation of their relationship. Edward was portrayed as a weak king dominated by his personal passions, while Hugh was demonized as an unscrupulous manipulator who exploited the monarch's vulnerability. Modern historians offer a more nuanced view. On one hand, they recognize that Hugh Despenser was indeed a greedy and ruthless politician, whose rapacity alienated virtually all the English nobility. On the other, they question some of the more sensationalist accounts of his relationship with Edward Hugh, acknowledging that accusations of sodomy were frequently used as a political weapon to delegitimize enemies. Whatever the true nature of their relationship, the fate of Hugh Despenser illustrates the dangerous intersections between power, sexuality, and politics in medieval England. His tortured and dismembered body served as a graphic warning of what happened when someone challenged social norms and accumulated powerful enemies. The story of Hugh Despenser also offers us reflections on how justice could be brutally theatricalized in medieval society. His execution was not just a legal act, but a carefully crafted public spectacle to communicate political and moral messages. The punishment of Despenser's body, especially his public castration, was laden with meanings about sexual transgression, political corruption, and restored social order. The fall of Hugh Despenser was as spectacular as his rise. In a few years, he went from relatively obscure knight to the most powerful man in the kingdom, only to end up as a quartered body displayed at the four corners of England. His story remains one of the most dramatic examples of the fluctuations of political fortune in medieval history. In a final irony, the regime that replaced Edward II and the Despensers would not last long. Queen Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, who had presided over Hugh's brutal execution, would themselves be overthrown just 4 years later, when the young Edward II effectively assumed power. Mortimer would face the same fate as Hugh, hanged as a traitor, though spared the additional tortures. The wheel of medieval political fortune had turned once more. Almost 700 years later, the story of Hugh Despenser continues to fascinate and disturb. In a recent survey, he was voted the greatest British villain of the 14th century, even receiving votes as one of the worst Britons of all time. His story has been dramatized in plays, historical novels, and television series, often portrayed as the archetype of the corrupt and manipulative courtier. Today we can look at Hugh Despenser's brutal execution with horror, recognizing the extreme cruelty that marked the medieval judicial system. At the same time, his story reminds us that the dynamics of power, political favoritism, and exploitation of privileged positions are not phenomenon exclusive to the distant past. The king's favorite, who was castrated and hanged in public, offers us a distant but still relevant mirror to reflect on the complex interactions between power, sexuality, greed, and justice that continue to shape our societies.